Hello, St. Louis. I am Terry Hatfield. I'm a longtime board member for the World Affairs Council of St. Louis. And by the way, let's go Cardinals today. I want to welcome you to the 2022 Great Decision Speaker Series, a program of the Foreign Policy Association. It is brought to you today by the World Affairs Council of St. Louis and sponsored by University of Missouri St. Louis Global. UMSO Global has been a partner for this series for many years. The World Affairs Council of St. Louis is a member-based organization that connects the local community to the world. Founded in 1948, it is our mission to build programs that promote engagement, understanding, relationships, and leadership in world affairs. Our program leaders today are retired generals Andrew Turley and Ken Hunziker. General Turley was a major general in the Air Force, where he served in both active and reserve in the military law positions at Wing, Command, and the Pentagon. He also served in the Bush 43 White House as acting general counsel in the executive office. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. General Hunziker was a lieutenant general in the Army. He graduated from West Point in 1975. He served as a commanding officer in the First Iraq War, headed the 5th Corps in Germany, and in his final posting was deputy commander of all forces in Iraq. He too was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal and a Bronze Star. Now, as we go along and you have questions, please type them into the Q&A area by clicking on that at the bottom of your screen. Generals, welcome to St. Louis.
Thank you, Terry. A quick introduction. Terry and I have been doing this for about 5 years down here in Florida at Harbor Ridge Yacht and Country Club, which you see on the slide. We both have military backgrounds, as Terry said, and I personally feel like I grew up in the military. My dad was commissioned during the Korean War when I was born, and then 35 years later, he retired as a 2-star general, and I felt like I moved post to camp and station, and then when I got commissioned, I retired 35 years later, again, as the deputy commander in Iraq. My background is a mixture of operational, joint, and basically Army requirements and resourcing. The reason I want to bring this up is because our backgrounds, you know, Andy and my background are from the operational side, working with other services, working with coalition governments, but also understanding what the requirements process is all about. I was in the Pentagon for 9/11 and spent the next 10 years as a general, either overseas commanding soldiers or working Pentagon requirements. Both Andy and I stay really focused on where the services are on our national strategy. And we have been basically talking about all the decisions we have to make that affect defense, but also other pieces of government in this program. When I left the military in 2010, the military was already frustrated in our ability to what we then call and continue to call our pivot to the Pacific. Mm-hmm. And the Middle East and European theaters have really taken front and center and not allowed us to basically move resources and do anything about China, which is, we believe, bottom line up front, is the #1 threat. Now, Andy and I presented to our group down here several times about China, but I wanted to make sure everybody got on the same sheet of music on how we feel about the fact that they are our #1 threat going forward for the next, basically for our lifetimes. So what we plan to do today is tell the history of the Quad, talk about the Quad, and as we go through this, we will leave time for discussion after we outline what the Quad's all about. Now, the Quad is obviously an acronym. It stands for Quadrennial Security Dialogue. It's a dialogue between 4 countries, the US, Australia, Japan, and India. Now, many observers would like it to be the Quint to include South Korea. And you notice that the title we have is, has China's attack on the emerging alliance backfired? And if you read the article in Great Decisions, that title was, geez, China takes on the Quad. So we've already given you a little, what our analysis is, basically. Go back, still stay on the front slide, please, Andy.
Okay.
Before I get started, one last thing. We talk in terms of diplomatic, information, military, and economic. The whole purpose here is to put as much pressure on China militarily and economically, which are the two great pillars of what it takes to be a great power. Those are the four elements of a great power: diplomatic, information, military, and economic. Next slide. So from China's perspective, go ahead, Andy.
I got it. A little slow on the uptake.
Yeah, China's biggest threat has historically been from the sea. And when you see how they're positioned and how big China is and its huge landmass, you know, one of the people that I used to work with in the Pentagon said, if you have a 1 million man army and it can't go anywhere, then it's really an issue. But what they have done is they're really putting a lot of time and energy into building out a Navy, because they recognize that everything has come from the sea. So they want a larger periphery, force military, and their first goal is to push U.S. forces out. And on the next slide, and don't go to it yet, is I'm going to talk a little bit about the East and South China Sea, which are the two areas of operation for China basically operating now. The second one is they really want to establish territorial claims over Taiwan. Again, South and East China Seas. And as you look at the map, they want to break through the thistles, and that's their words, where they want to escape the geography that has kept China bottled up. And finally, the Belt and Road Initiative, which Andy and I have talked about several times, is the key to their international strategy. It's 3,100 projects in 138 countries, and it's where they have built bilateral agreements that basically, A, squeeze out Taiwan, but B, get those countries involved in what we call debt traps, where they are forced to then give in huge concessions to China, and then China controls, in many cases, their votes on the UN and things along those lines. So let's go to the map real quick. So when you look at the South China Sea, you look at the Philippines, you look at where it comes down. And the reason it's so critical here, and what's the most incredible piece of geography here, is if you look down by Malaysia, you see the Strait of Malacca. 60% of the world's commerce goes through the Strait of Malacca. So if you control access through the South China Sea, you can see what it does. And the U.S. recognizes that. I mean, when you look at the U.S. forces and where we're strategically positioned, we have our Pacific Command, which is a 4-star joint headquarters in Hawaii with all its components from all of the different services. We have a division in the 2nd Infantry Division up in Korea, which is not in this slide, but on the East China Sea, which is just to the north. We have a division and from the Marine Corps sitting on Okinawa, which again, just north of Japan. We have huge forces in Japan for all the services, to 2-star command and several Air Force folks. We're in discussions with the Philippines to get back in positioning there. As you remember, we had a footprint there for a long time. So we have huge positioning right on China's doorstep, and one of their goals is to push us out. And how are they going to do that? Well, the first thing they're going to do is, if you look at the Parcel Islands, which is in the center there, and you go and look at right above them are the Woody Islands and then the Spratlys. And what they've done in all three cases is they've actually built forward operating bases in all three locations. In the Parcells case, it's with 20 different places. In the Spratlys, it's with 7 different locations. They've actually forward positioned fighters, missiles, radars. And so they've already extended their footprint. And if you look at that, that's almost a nice little wall as you look at as where they are in the neighborhood. So again, this is the area of operations. This is physically how they're trying to break out of the thistles. And this is what we're talking about today with the Quad. Next slide. Andy, over to you.
Okay. Well, having read about the development of the Quad, I was amused that this really kind of grew out of some side discussions that happened at some of the ASEAN meetings. So instead of, they have the dating service that says, oh, it's just lunch. Well, in this case, it's just breakfast. And what would happen is the representatives from Japan, Australia, India, and the United States would have side discussions on and they were very informal about how they can work together. One of the driving forces on this too was back in 2004, we had a massive humanitarian relief program that involved all of these nations. And what had happened is that, as they got to work together a little bit, and of course, Australia and Japan are very close allies of ours, they thought, well, maybe we can do a little bit more. And they started off in the 2000s. It never gained any traction, but this was when Shinzo Abe was the Japanese prime minister. This was his focus, and he was really the driving force between taking a multilateral approach to China's increasingly assertive strategic posture. And one of the things, and Ken highlighted some of the bases and so forth that are in the East China Sea, the South China Sea. One of the limiting factors that China faces is that they aspire to have a blue water navy, and they do not have that right now. So a lot of their development has been closer to home. So this kind of strategy is very important for them to push America back a little bit, because America is the big challenge. The United States is the big challenge to them in this area. And as they had these discussions at the summit, what they wanted, and the basic principle was to advance a free and open Indo-Pacific region. And the United States has actually been quite active every year. Being a lawyer, I get to go to legal conferences. And for many years, I went to our Indo-Pacific Command legal conferences, which are often held not just in Hawaii, but also in other areas around the Pacific. And there we brought everybody in, and including, I attended a couple sessions back in might have been 2011, 2012, that actually included some Chinese representatives. So we have sought to become a force in the Indo-Pacific region. And Beijing saw all of this. They said, well, it's just breakfast. We can't see where there's anything going on here that we need to worry about, and it's something that'll just soon dissipate. Well, not so fast. Although it had lukewarm support from the Bush White House, Bush 43, it caught fire again once Shinzo Abe came back into office. And one of the key things that turned the tide here was when the Chinese and the military and the Indians had clashes up on the border in June 2020. And India lost some people, and they were furious because India pretty much is a non-aligned nation. We don't have a treaty relationship with them. And what those clashes on the border highlighted was the fact that the Indians needed to take some tough action against the Chinese because they're a real threat to them. And so India, which has been, they went for breakfast and that was about it. But now what they said after June of 2020, they said, we need some security alliances to help push back on the Chinese threat that we face. And what the effect that this had was it pushed India right into the arms of the other Quad members. We approached Korea to participate in some of the working groups. We wanted to bring them into the fold, and it wasn't strictly a security focus because many of these countries are also members of ASEAN. Of course, that's where they all met, which is really, I always equate ASEAN with more of an EU type of operation rather than a NATO type of operation. That there are security elements to it, but it's more a broader spectrum of where these countries can cooperate. So we approached Korea. We also approached New Zealand and Vietnam to engage with us in some of these working groups. So we took it slow. And in March of 2021, we started to talk about things like maritime security to meet the challenges of some of the in the East China and the South China Seas. And then where this really came into focus was in September of 2021, they had the leaders of Australia, Japan, and India. Bush hosted them Biden hosted them at the White House. And that was a big impetus to go forward. Ken?
Sorry, I had to take myself off mute. So China finally reacts. So their initial reaction was, it's a headline grabbing idea. Not so fast, because it really was starting to, gather some teeth. Again, this is just a dialogue. This is not a NATO. And so they basically said, you're creating a NATO, and we're not really. Mm-hmm. So how did the Chinese act? Well, there's an idiom from the Chinese that's really kill one, warn 100. In this case, they wanted to kill one, which was Australia, and warn 2. So they really went after Australia, and they went after them in the press. They restricted their imports. They talked about them in all different forums, and they went everywhere they could to basically, threaten and take Australia down. And simultaneously, they tried to repair relations with Japan, which wasn't going to go anywhere. And then there is the India, and we're going to get to India on the last bullet there. But we talked earlier about the debt traps and the things along those lines. China really was trying to make deals with Bangladesh, other countries there, and trying to use their economic influence to sway them against the Quad and what the Quad was trying to do, just to have a discussion and a dialogue. And then finally, they applied for the TPP, but they weren't really a welcome partner, because the 3 things about the TPP are labor rights, level playing field with private enterprise, which they violate in both cases, and then freedom of data flows, which we know is not something the Chinese will sign up for. So basically the premises for being part of the TPP, they didn't qualify for. So obviously they can't become a member. Andy, you want to talk? We added this last bullet before we presented last week. You want to talk the last bullet here, Andy?
Sure. I want to make one comment about the TPP too, is that this was a major initiative by the United States on part of what they call their pivot to the East, their pivot to Asia, to join an organization where they had to, and to build alliances there, again, to counter China's influence and China's expanding influence. And in 2017, we just summarily abandoned it. And it was very interesting. We had Stephen Moore, who was an economist who had worked, had advised the Trump administration, came here to speak. And I had a chance to chat with him afterwards. And I said, to my mind, the single biggest mistake we made in terms of dealing with China was pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And he looked at me, he says, you're probably right. So what I see the Quad is doing is we're trying to get back engaged with our partners over there. Now, the last bullet goes to a very interesting recent action that just happened a couple of weeks ago. China reached out. India, as you may have read, they're kind of waffling in terms of support to Russia with regard to Ukraine. And of course, China has been, they kind of put their hands in their pockets and they mumble and all of that. But China has actually reached out to India to say, we really need to support Russia in some ways. We condemn the violence, we condemn the war and all of this stuff. And we look at this, and of course, the whole purpose of the Quad was to oppose China's activity and aggressiveness. And how is this going to play? I think it's too early to tell. I've been trying to keep an eye out right now for kind of what more has happened with regard to India and their works with China. So I guess when they had their border clashes, it was a question of, they were really ticked off at that point, but maybe time healed some wounds. I don't know, but it does have definite implications for the Quad. And it's one of these things that we're just gonna have to wait and see. So the current, what you were reading in the papers today has very much application to what we're seeing developments in Asia. Ken?
On the British invasion, so in September 2021, right after the leaders have gotten together, there's the Trilateral Security Partnership, AUKUS, takes place. And this really caught a lot of people by surprise, myself included.
Mm.
And basically, it was the Brits basically saying, we want to get involved. And the core of this agreement is really the silent running for the nuclear subs in Australia. And it's a sharing among the Five Eyes on what we're doing in the nuclear world. Unfortunately, in this situation, it cut out France because they thought they had an agreement here, and there was some discussion, all the rest about that. But this was a huge move. This is basically, not only is it the Quad, but it's now the Brits getting involved in the area. And, you know, they have a long history of being involved, of course, with India and the rest of these countries in the colonial days. And to say Beijing went bonkers is really, to say the least. They really put them on their heels. And so when you think in terms of what Xi has said, his stated goal is that by 2049, China will become the global leader in terms of composite national strength and international influence. And if you think about this fall, and the national conference is going to take place, where over 200 leaders from China will get together, they'll confirm that Xi is going to be basically the premier through 2027, because that's what he's already agreed to. They are not going to change their strategic look or their policy as far as what's going on. And so from my perspective, I think the Quad has gained a lot more traction. Next slide.
And I agree with that. So this brings us to the age-old question of how does this end? First of all, is China really a threat? I think that's more of a rhetorical question. But more importantly, is the Quad the answer, both from an economic and a military perspective? Another thing, of course, we've kind of gone back and forth. Asia has never been a major focus for us in the eyes of some. So the question is, will the US stay committed to AUKUS and the Quad? And of course, more importantly, should we? Ken, on the other questions, your thoughts?
So I think looking forward here, and I want to talk a little bit about India before we go a little bit further, because from my perspective, India has been caught looking both ways. 60% of their equipment comes from Russia. They see how well it's not performing in Ukraine. They also are tied economically with a lot of trade, especially gas and oil. So the reason, and you know, and if you go back to the history, they're still mad at us about Pakistan, for crying out loud. So from that perspective, India is a huge player, and I think they are critical to making the Quad a reality. And I think the sooner South Korea joins, the more powerful it will be. So what do you think? Is this tied to China's Belt and Road Initiative? Is there something we should do there? Is there something else that we should be looking at as far as diplomatic, economic, and informational? Or in the military perspective, I mean, China has built their second carrier. The first one was pretty much a rehash for what the Russians had given them. The second one was built from the ground up. We don't know how technically competent it is, but we do know that it's a player, and we think it's going to be comparable to what we're putting in the water right now. So we'd like to open it up for questions, and we're right on our timeline.
Yes.
Terry?
So let me, I'm going to ask this first question because Michael asked this question before you guys even started. So, and it has to do with India, as you might expect. So with India not participating in sanctions against Russia, abstained from the vote on UN Human Rights Commission on the removal of Russia, are they a reliable ally? Now, you all spoke to that, but maybe you could kind of emphasize a little bit more your thoughts.
Andy?
My thought is that they're not a reliable ally. I think, as Ken put it quite well, they're interested in playing both sides of the street, and that can be dangerous for those on each side of the street. They kind of want to have their cake and eat it too. They were furious with the Chinese, and so much so that they blocked whole categories of goods when they right after the border incursions. But yet now they're saying, well, we're not so sure now, and that is a dangerous thing, because they are not, and especially with Modi's focus on nationalism, I think that we have to be very careful in our dealings with them, because it's not the India of Indira Gandhi or some of the prior leaders. Ken?
I think Modi is absolutely transactional here. I don't think you can count on him to be a partner in anything. It's what's good for him and what's good for India. And he's not looking for, he's looking more what's tactical, what's good for India now so he can stay in power, but not what's good for India in the long run, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, and I agree with that assessment.
Yeah, good question and comments. How do we counter China's Silk Road initiative? I mean, so it's not, I mean, I guess there's military aspects, but mostly it's economic. And there's a lot of people a lot of countries that have bought into that initiative and like it because it brought projects to them, ports built, roads, railroads, et cetera. How do we counter that?
Well, go ahead. I have my thoughts on this, Andy. You?
Yes.
Let me go.
Why don't you go ahead?
So I think, we have USAID and we have the State Department. And in many cases, politically, we have underfunded those efforts. And I'm part of an organization that is trying to make sure that we keep the funding at a certain level where we can counterbalance the Chinese. But that's a huge investment. And in every case that we make an investment, we're not doing it for the betterment of the US. We're doing it for the betterment of that country. So it becomes a very, very tough task because, again, we're only 4.5% of the world's population. So how many of these other countries can we go help? You look at 3,100 projects. How do we want to counteract those? My personal opinion is I think not every one of these cases should we go after them. But if there's a strategic reason for the U.S. to be involved, let's say it's rare earth metals. Let's say they're partnering with a country that has a large percentage of rare earth metals, and we want to counteract that now because that's the future. So we should look strategically on the countries that they're getting involved with, that they're basically setting debt traps for, and we should go after them with all the elements we have, whether it's diplomatic, information, military, and economic, and pick our wins for where we want to get involved. Because we can't cover them all. 131 countries, we can't come close to doing that.
And I think that's right. And the interesting development is that Ken mentioned rare earth metals. A lot of that is focused in Africa. And we have been back and forth a lot on our commitment to Africa, but the Chinese have gone in with full pocketbooks and handing out money, but their military has come in right behind them. For example, I don't know if people know that the Chinese actually have a base in Djibouti. My son was stationed over there, and they had a Chinese base right down the road. And they're trying to use this as a lever to establish more of a military presence there. So it's a coordinated effort, and they're not hiding the ball. They are right out in the open about it. And I think that the biggest thing is that we need to recognize it. I think Ken's right. I think we need to pick our spots in terms of what we do, and we need to counter it, because what happens is when these deals go bad, it's like working with the mafia. They go really bad. And also when they're building ports and so forth, which they did in South America that we had talked about last year, they didn't give jobs to the local folks. They brought in all these Chinese workers to do it. So it's all about them. It really is. And the more we can get people to recognize that, I think the more effective we can be. Now, on the other hand, we have a number of foreign help here. And one of the guys, and they're just great kids. These are our servers and things like that. Well, I was talking with one day, and who's from Jamaica, and said, well, what do you think about, because something had come up that they just built a new highway in Jamaica, the Chinese had. And what do you think about this project? And he says, it's great. So the problem is these countries are seeing the short-term benefits, but not understanding the long-term strategic implications of it. That's my view.
Absolutely agree.
Good answer, guys. Good answer. So how should we manage China? I mean, I know you guys are military guys, but it seems to me that there's a couple different ways of dealing with China. One is let's just one up them on military. If they have 500 boats, we'll have 510, or missiles, and all of that. Or another is to continue to work hard from a economic standpoint, partners together. I mean, today we're not even talking to one another. Must be talking to one another at some level, but at the top level, we're not talking to one another, which seems dangerous to me. What do you guys think?
Well, one of the things that's happened with COVID is, we've all looked at our supply chain, and we all recognize that, China's been our great partner. And Terry, would back in our discussions here at Harbor Ridge, when this came up, somebody hypothesized, I think it was either Terry or me, that this may be the start of the end of globalization. And the fact that, part of globalization is taking advantage of some other countries' ability to make something cheaper, better, faster, and then taking the benefit of it and having a trade advantage based upon that happening. But we've also seen the downside is in times of crisis, in times when we need stuff, when it comes to like microchips and stuff like that, I think we got to really say, do we want to be beholden to a country that we're not necessarily, good friends with right now to make those critical issues? I think one of the things that people don't know about with Ukraine is we put sanctions in 2014. And those sanctions were so critical. In one case, they were not able to make their next generation tank. So they still have the T-72 in the battlefield, which is not surviving and not doing too well. And their next tank they had coming out, it's not on the battlefield because we held back all the technical opportunities, the technology, all the critical metals they had, all the electronic components, so they couldn't do it. So I think we're going to end up having to go and figure out what we're no longer going to be tied, be relying on China for. And maybe it is the end of globalization, because we're not going to do it militarily. They're going to build up, we'll stay built up, we'll both be powered. It's going to have to be, the economic ability to affect them, because they need the marketplaces. The more marketplaces you shut down for China, the better off we're going to be in the long run.
I think that's exactly right. And I think the economic pressure, because let's face it, they are riding on their economic largesse, as it were, to spread their influence. And the supply chain problems that we've seen highlight that in spades. So it's, there was one point, George W. Bush had thought, which is why the Quad never took off back in the 2000s. He thought that, well, he didn't want to support it because he wanted to kind of co-opt them. In other words, reach out to them and see where we can find areas where we can work together and so forth, and invite Chinese lawyers to Indo-Pacific legal conferences like that. But it's really it's interesting, but I don't think that has done very, very well in terms of a strategy. So I think what we need to do is the current administration talks about they're a primary competitor now, and I think we need to keep that front and center. We're not saying they're the enemy. We are saying that they are a primary competitor, and we need to figure out the ways when we can compete effectively with them.
Good. So let's talk a little bit about the war in Ukraine. I don't want to necessarily focus on it because we're really talking Asia, but I think it's a big world and there's a lot going on. And so were you guys surprised at the performance of the Russian military in the Ukraine?
I was really surprised. But then again, as Ken points out, they suffered from some of the restrictions from the sanctions that arose out of the period back in 2014 when they took over the Crimea. I was surprised that they did as poorly as they did. And of course, it's still an ongoing thing. I have been so impressed with what the Ukrainians have been doing. They have been fabulous. So it's, I don't know. Ken, what do you think?
Well, I'll be very candid. It surprised me because they're not a paper tiger, but and what's really fascinating here is they did have some successes going into Georgia. They did get their nose, bloodied a little bit there, but they made a lot of changes and they upped what they were spending in GDP as far as for their forces. Then they went into Syria, and before then, Chechnya, but then they went into Syria. And they were effective, but then when you do the analysis on why they were effective, they basically used the same technique. They bombed from the air. They didn't have a great ground fight. They had no opposition. So this is the first time they've ever really had what I would call a traditional land warfare situation. And, they talk about tactics versus logistics. And we always say that professionals talk about logistics, and, that's where the wannabes talk tactics. And what I was totally amazed at here, and I guess I wasn't witty enough of it, was they don't have any trucks. They don't have the long lines of communication. We call lines of communication. So they're relying totally on railroads for supply, where there's all fuel, ammunition, food, water, everything comes in through the railheads. And when you look at the rail, the rail network in Europe, very easy to interdict at key nodes. And that's what the Ukrainians have done. And so they haven't been able to get reinforcements up there. When you read the reports of what's going on, basically Russian soldiers are going to, basically stopping at gas stations, going to people's homes. They're looting to feed themselves. And, it's really a tragedy from that perspective because, and not a tragedy, but I mean, it's just showing how really unprepared they were for what I would call the long fight. They thought they'd be in there in 2 or 3 days, take off Kiev, however you want to say it, and that would be the battle. And that's not what happened. So I'm struggling now because I don't know how this ends. And I read everything about it. And, Mark Hertling's my classmate. He's on TV a lot talking about it. And you see them positioning to the east. And you say, so what's the strategic value of going to the east? Well, I think it's basically to secure the areas that they wanted to go after initially and then sue for peace. So if you think about what's going on now, the movements that took place last night, they've basically given up on what's going on in the center, but they're moving to the east. So that's the next fight that's going to take place. But really was surprising how poorly they did perform.
Yes, and very early on they lost their secure communications, and communications are everything. The New York Times they were using cell phones to communicate with their troops. And the New York Times, if you go back to them, they ran an article 3 or 4 days ago where they had all of these recordings of the Russians going back and forth. And what it belied was the fact that they were scrambling. They didn't know what was going on. And so they lost a lot of capability like that. And it's surprising, but it is what it is right now. But I agree with Ken's assessment that moving back to the east, and I remember talking with somebody a couple of years ago about this, and he said the Donbass is the key to that whole area, the Donbass and Crimea, and they're moving back, and they're going to have a new assault, supposedly, in the Donbass region. So we'll see how it plays out.
The critical thing that really has come out is they don't have a non-commissioned officer corps. That's why you see generals and colonels getting killed on the battlefield, because they got no one down there to lead half the soldiers are conscripts too. So when you look at our services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, we've been at war for 20 years. We have perfected land and air warfare and sea warfare basically by multiple repetitions, and they don't have any of that. And so they're going to this thing with recruits that aren't that well trained. They're conscripts. They have a conscript every year. 1 April was the day it came out this year. And those conscripts as reinforcements, you can't get them in the fight. They don't have a basic training. Basically, their conscripts go to a unit to learn how to fight. You don't have any units for them to go to. They don't have a school system like we have, and they don't have non-commissioned officers. So for the long haul, they have what they have. And they're going to have to use more rubbling of cities and going after populations and things like that, because they're not going to be able to survive and win on the battlefield. They're going to have to use other tactics besides that.
I think that's right.
Yeah, very good.
So Terry, I saw a question that I really thought was fascinating from Wayne Ryback. I cheated and looked ahead. And Wayne, you asked about the demographics. So I'm fascinated by demographics personally, because if you look at China and you look at Russia specifically, one of the challenges that the Russians have right now is they don't have, they have an inverted pyramid on their population. If you're a Russian male, less than half the Russian male live to see the age of 56. Think about that. Less than half the Russian males live to see the age of 56. And so they have an aging population that's not doing well health-wise, and they're not having a lot of live births, and they're below zero population growth. So they don't have reinforcements. They don't have a big bubble there. China has a huge demographic bubble. And so how they're going to sort that out with this generation that wants to get paid off, basically, and how they're going to continue to do this, they need markets. They need to keep what they're doing just to stay economically stable going forward. And that's a big challenge for both countries, in my personal opinion.
I agree.
So let's answer this question, because I think it's another really critical one. It's from Linda. And because of the rare earths, shouldn't we be pushing recycling of things that contain rare earths in the US, in addition to trying to work with the African nations and have rare earth deposits starting now? How do we outbid China in those countries? So, I know you guys know this, but 80 to 85% of all rare earths are produced in China.
Mm-hmm.
And rare earths go in all these energy-related products, turbines, and solar panels, et cetera. So, what do you think?
I think we need to identify it and go after it. And recycling might be one approach. It can't hurt.
It's not going to be a major player, but it can't hurt.
I agree. But what we need to do is Africa is a huge continent with huge resources, and we've been so wishy-washy about it, I think, over the years. At times, we've really leaned forward. At other times, it's like, oh, they're all fighting with each other all the time, and we just don't really want to get involved. But yet, I think we really need a good strategy for dealing with Africa, and not a military strategy so much, but more of an economic strategy, and really harp on the fact that we can work with some of these folks. Of course, you have corruption, you have everything else. It's not an easy road.
Yeah.
So, guys, I don't know how much you know about this next question. It was from Michael. He says, "Is it so much the East as closing off Ukraine from the Azov and Black Seas and strangling the country economically? Does Ukraine have the sea defenses to prevent this?"
I don't think they have the sea defenses, and B, I think he's absolutely right. Because when you look at what Ukraine does and how they export, it has to go through the Black Sea, and whether it's the wheat that they produce, or they make most of the engines for most of the jets around the world, and they're a very technical country. So from that perspective, if you cut off that port, you cut off the ability for them to have access to the Black Sea, that will cripple the country.
I think that's right.
Okay, so guys, this is a Terry question. I think I must ask every time we talk about military, but we're going to spend roughly $750 billion. The Biden administration's asking for a 4% increase, which I know General Hunziker doesn't believe is enough.
And neither does General Turley.
The two generals don't believe it's enough. But China only spends $250 billion. So, how is it possible that China can compete with the US militarily?
Well, they can't right now, and it's going to take a big investment. And it's an investment are they willing to make, or are they going to keep the Belt and Road Initiative? Or do they need just enough? Is it one or two carrier groups? Is it, do they build out a bunch of fleet of frigates and, smaller scale ships and don't worry about the carriers? Do they get more and more missiles? Do they look at, what are they going to do at that level? So they look at their mix of what they're going to do. So from a military perspective, every time they build something, it's modernizing. Our challenge in our military is we are looking at fleets that are generationally way behind. I'll talk specifically to the Army. The Army built the Big Five in the 80s. That's the Abrams tank, the Bradley fighting vehicle, and there are two helicopters, both the Apache and the Black Hawk, and then our air defense systems, the Patriot. All five of those systems are 1980s technology that has been upgraded with what we call PIPs, product improvement plans. In every case, you can't keep the technology current if you're not going to upgrade your fleet and do different things and build a new tank, build a new fighting vehicle. Those have been shunted because of 20 years of a global war on terror, where every dollar, most of the dollars we spent on the defense side was to just drive those tanks longer, those Bradleys longer, fly those helicopters longer, and deploy those vehicles longer. And the fleets are aged. And so, and in every case, we've got to modernize. If we don't modernize, Terry, that fleet will become obsolete in the next 20 years.
And I think that's a key point to make. I know in the Air Force side, for example, I think one of the single most effective fighter aircraft in our inventory is the A-10. It is low and slow. It is single purpose, but boy, does it do the job. And it was interesting because the Air Force, they like sexy fighter jets. And so they wanted to develop some more. And when I was a senior attorney at the Pentagon after I retired on the military side, I was the legislative counsel for the Air Force. We would get lectured time and again about, we know you guys want to get rid of the A-10, but we're not going to let you do it. And part of that mindset is that I think what we have to do is when we look to the future, we have to think in terms of, break the mold a little bit. And you can't upgrade things forever. B-52s were first fielded in 1952. Some of the current pilots in B-52s today, their grandfathers flew the same tail numbers. And how do we break out of that? I'm not sure how.
Well, it's a bigger discussion, that's for sure.
Yep.
But we're going to have to become much more efficient in how we spend dollars, how we buy things. It's just how we buy things. So,
and you bring up a great point. And the real issue there would be acquisition reform.
Right.
Because in too many cases, Terry, we have, in some cases, we have to build 2 prototypes to actually do a fly off or a drive off or a shoot off. And, when you look at dealing with Congress and all the rest of that stuff and how we have to have this process take place, it's not efficient by design. And so if you want to be efficient, it's going to take a whole different acquisition process than what we have now.
Okay.
I think that's right.
A couple other maybe tougher questions. The first one's not so bad. Ken, Secretary Austin, and I just thought that was such a good question and answer. Mm-hmm. And the question was, what do you think about this guy?
I'm Lloyd Austin. I graduated from West Point the same year, and I've served with General Austin. And I've never been in a theater of operation with him, but I know of him operationally, and he is one of the most incredibly candid, thoughtful, charismatic leaders at the operational, strategic, and at the tactical level. What I love about Lloyd is he has the ability to listen and then basically trust his subordinates and then give phenomenal guidance going forward. So he's incredibly gifted. He has the ability to take on large projects, he's a big thinker, and he thinks strategically in everything he does. So I'm a big fan. Obviously, we've known each other a long time, and I think he's the right. You pick a right guy at the right time. And who would you want to be the Secretary of Defense when you're dealing with, basically Putin and the Russians and what they're doing? He and Mark Milley are probably 2 of the guys I'd want there right now.
Yeah,
I agree.
Good segue.
I agree with that assessment. Yes, and my experience with him has been, of course, I didn't know him personally, but when he was the CENTCOM commander, I had a chance to work with him on a number of different issues involving Iraq and especially support for the Kurds. I'm a lawyer. They come and ask me, how can we spend our money for X, Y, and Z? So we actually had a number of interactions with him when he was the CENTCOM commander, because he saw the Kurds as being one of our best allies in that region. And he wanted to do everything he could to try to get supplies to them, to try to get armaments to them and all of that stuff. And there was only so much that they could do. But I was really impressed with his in dealing with him. And of course, it's my boss and I dealt with General Austin and his lawyer, but he really thinks things through, and I'm really quite impressed with him. And I think I agree with Ken. I think he's the right guy, right time, right position.
Very good. I got 2 more quick questions, but I'm sure they're not easy answers. But the first is on TPP. Why haven't we tried to get back into the TPP? Do either one of you know that? I don't.
I don't either, and I think that we should. So
I assume it's a back burner with everything else that's going on, Terry.
yeah.
I mean, it's probably on the list, but it's not high on it right now.
Yep.
So let's then finish with something that's on the front burner. And I asked you guys this 2 weeks ago. How's the Biden administration, Secretary of State, how's the administration doing in persecuting this war? And I think, broaden that, in terms of Blinken and foreign policy, Biden, how are these guys doing from your perspective, from a military, maybe, military men, how you think they're doing?
I think, when they had the security conference in Munich, one of the things that came out of that is one of the people that was there said, basically, we ought to give a medal to Putin for basically re-energizing NATO. And when you look at what this administration has done, is it's kept NATO viable through funding and the like. But with what's taking place in Ukraine, everybody's commitment, they've always paid their dues for what they do in NATO, but they haven't stood up to the goal for 2025, which was a certain percent of their GDP. Well, what's taking place with Russia and Ukraine, that's all changed. That changed overnight. That's changed in the last 2 months. And so from that perspective, we've shown global leadership here that we haven't seen in a long time. And I think that's a positive spin there.
And I agree with that. I think they've leveraged the situation to just jump in and take it on. I think the biggest surprise that Putin ran across was the fact that by doing this, taking this military action, he unified NATO against him. He drove all the NATO countries together saying, we're not putting up with this. And I think that our leaders have taken advantage of that. I think we'll continue to take advantage of that. And I think it's kind of a new day for NATO. That's one of the ways that I look at it too. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
Yeah.
Fabulous. That's great. That's great. Okay, just a quick question for you, Andy. Are the Nationals going to be at the bottom of their division or just second to the bottom?
The Nationals are going to go all the way this year, even though it's a building year.
Yeah, okay. I want to thank you guys. It was a great discussion. We learned a lot about the Quad and our foreign policy challenges. I want to say that the next World Affairs Council program will be held on April 14th at 6 p.m. It is part of the International Connection Series and will be about cybersecurity. The next Great Decisions program will be on April the 21st, and that'll be at 6 p.m. on Myanmar and the ASEAN with Professor Stephen Bagwell. There's links to those down in the chat room. If you look at chat, if you're interested, you can just click on those and register. So finally, we exist through memberships. So please join the World Affairs Council if you haven't. You can do that on the chat room as well. I want to thank you guys, the two generals. Thank you very much for taking your time out to do this. And thanks to all in St. Louis. And we'll see you at the next meeting.
Thanks again, Terry. This was a lot of fun. Thanks, Andy.
Yeah.
Thanks, Wingman.
It was great.
You bet.
Thank you so much.
See you guys.